May your bulletproof niggers drop like rain, and your church spires attain a higher state of grace. My lily of the valley, the time is at hand to ring your bells and uproot your cellulose stem. I bought hardware, software, and binoculars to trace your ways of taking the eyes from my head. And none of it worked. We've been coming to a head for too long. Aircraft prick the veins of your rainbow as they shoot you in soft focus to trace the tramlines of your cellulite skin. But with the grace of a diva on a crackling screen, you never stemmed their cameras, you're forever getting out of hand. Once in school, on a grease-proof page, we had to trace the busts and booms of your body. And I was ashamed to hand mine in because it lacked what my dad called grace. And I wish I was the centre of a raindrop that's falling on your head, the key to your handcuffs, the drug that could reconjugate your head. For Belfast, if you'd be a Hollywood film, then I'd be Grace Kelly on my way to Monaco, to pluck the stem of a Maybell with its rows of empty shells, its head of 100 blinded eyes. I would finger your trace in that other city's face and bite its free hand as it fed me, or try to soothe the stinging of your rain. His Majesty the King has been pleased to include the name of Mr. Alfred Bromwell Thomas of London amongst other recipients of the birthday honours, a knighthood being conferred upon Mr. Thomas. Irish architects will unite in rejoicing at the honour which King Edward has conferred upon Mr. Thomas, because he has well earned it by his masterly design for the new City Hall, Belfast. Excellently conceived and well carried out. An exuberant Edwardian wedding cake of a city hall in Portland stone with fine marble interiors. When it was opened by the Lord Lieutenant, the Earl of Aberdeen, on the 1st of August 1906, the building had cost over £360,000, of which £21,500 had been spent on Italian marbles, £10,000 in carving and sculpture, and £7,000 in plasterwork. It is reported that the scheme for extending hotel facilities in Belfast is about to bear fruit. A central site running from Donegal Square east back to Arthur Street is mentioned in this connection. The building is to consist of 9 stories. It is to contain 300 bedrooms, each with a bathroom attached. It is stated that Sir Alfred Bromwell Thomas is to be the architect for the new undertaking. An address on the art of architecture was delivered on the 21st of April 1925 before the Belfast Rotary Club by Sir Bromwell Thomas. The first part of Rotary, he said, was for the good of the city, and he would like them to conceive in their imaginations what the heart of their capital city ought to be. There are few people, he went on, with a greater pride in their city than the people of Belfast. It is now a capital city of the empire. One wondered what outward and visible evidence of that fact would be reflected for future generations to see in the architecture of the city. How delightful it would be if they could carry out a plan, which is quite feasible, of opening up squares at the ends of Wellington Place and Chichester Street, so that with Donegal Square they would have a series of 3 great squares in the city, joined by imposing streets. So one cannot but hope that the businessmen of Donegal Place will actually meet, as Sir Bromwell suggests, and will positively discuss a scheme for the uniform beautification of that central thoroughfare, and that the triple square plan will be, later, if not sooner, carried into effect, so that the central garden square at the City Hall shall be balanced by 2 other squares, one at the east end of Chichester Street, the other at the west end of Wellington Place, each with its gardens and noble edifices. The death has occurred of Sir Bromwell Thomas, Fellow of the RIBA, the distinguished architect who designed the Belfast City Hall. The hall is regarded as his greatest achievement. Sir Bromwell had many friends in Northern Ireland, which he visited frequently, the last occasion being in July 1947. One of the views that he pressed unsuccessfully on Lord Craigavon was that the Northern Ireland Parliament buildings should be erected in the markets area of the city instead of at Stormont.
For the visitor to Belfast, like myself, one's first impression of the city is one of shock. Shock at the meanness of the houses, the ugly and drab streets, and of course the gaping expanses of emptiness like the one around me. It takes some time for this initial impression to be overcome. Some of it is not devastation after all, it appears. Rather, it's carefully planned demolition for Phase 1 of the urban motorway, the link between the M1 and the M2. Tomorrow's question is, tomorrow's road, how far will it go? Well, believe it or not, this is Belfast of the future, Belfast after the revolution.
Matthew is somebody with a very strong sense of mission. With the word arrogance, more like a more aggressive kind of thing. Well, certain types of the more individualistic modern architects who are more loudmouth, very convinced about their own importance. And I'm not sure that Matthew was quite the same sort of character, really. I mean, he's certainly probably arrogant, very much below the surface, but was maybe a bit more urbane. And this is probably what might have recommended him to the sort of governing elite in the time in Northern Ireland, that he wouldn't seem to be somebody who was a loud, swaggering kind of person. He was somebody who was, on the one hand had self-assurance, but he was able to convey that in a somewhat quiet way. He became involved in Belfast because there was a planning assault on Belfast Corporation and on its ideological and practical conservatism. And the progressive people, Oliver and Ronald Green, they managed to manoeuvre McKee into a corner whereby they got him to say that he wouldn't mind having the boundaries put into question, providing somebody was brought in to do an external evaluation of it. And then Oliver phoned up Matthew and kind of got him to come over the next day, just before Belfast Corporation could have second thoughts about it. Matthew would be very experienced with this, because the same thing was done with Glasgow Corporation in the 1950s. In Scotland, the equation is totally different. What Glasgow Corporation wanted to do was to redevelop slums but keep the population in the rateable value, whereas what Belfast Corporation wanted to do was not to build any houses because it would create trouble. But the mechanism was the same, that they were kind of government planners with a kind of technocratic recalcitrant people who wanted to obstruct enlightened mandarins who were pursuing some enlightened mission. He would just have regarded Belfast Corporation as a rerun of Glasgow Corporation, but with a slightly different agenda.
The actual Matthew report itself boils down to 6 points. The first one was the stop line, which was utterly critical to the whole philosophy behind it. It was the first time there was going to be a line drawn around the city. The second one was the fact that there was going to be a new city created as a counter-magnet to the influx of population. The third one was the growth times, which basically had the idea of that's where the people would live and take the pressure off Belfast. And the last three were interesting ones. But first of all, there was the protection of the countryside and coast, which remains right through to today. I mean, the whole question of what we now call Greenbelt down from that. Then it was the single planning authority for the region. That had been advocated in the 1940s, and it hadn't come to pass, but Matthew gave credence for it. And the final thing, compensation for the refusal of permission to build.
Up until 1965, if you were refused planning permission, you were entitled to compensation for the value of the land for the proposed use. That meant that the councils were very scared of refusing planning permission. And this came to a head at Shaw's Bridge. They got a massive planning application to build a major new housing development, and the council wanted to refuse it, but they couldn't afford to refuse it planning permission because it was going to cost so much in compensation. John Oliver, having spoken to Matthew about it, persuaded the minister to pay the compensation to all the planning authorities, and so they refused the planning permission, and you now know Shaw's Bridge is the Lagan Valley Regional Park. Compensation was the biggest element of allowing planning to take decisions on planning grounds.
The architects were just aware of this. There was never any great lectures given or taught. I think Matthew came over and spoke once. I mean, although it looks very thick and all this sort of thing, the actual sort of stuff is academic. In the case of Newton Abbey, sporting facilities were being mooted, and he said there should be 2 squash courts and a badminton court for a conurbation in excess of 100,000 or more, and this was absolutely laughed at. And this really sort of colours the rest of the plan. And all he did, in my opinion, was to put the stop line on. And the stop line was the one that we could use in court and say, well, Matthew said stop.
I just think architecture was overwhelmed by other greater factors than Matthew Plan, and I don't remember anything about Matthew Plan or any impact it had. My impression graduating around 1970 was that there was a lot of post-war catching up, school building, leisure centres, an overwhelming amount of work, and it was nothing to do with the Matthew Plan. It was a whole change in lifestyle in the 60s. With clothes for young people, drink was affordable, and there was big, huge grants for universities, which opened third level education up. So there was a big social change which impacted on architecture and aspirations. And then, of course, in '69, the troubles that hit a lot of that in the head. People have not invested in Northern Ireland because they're not certain about its political and economic future.
I think that the Matthew Plan was about saying there's a stop line. In a way, you look at it, it seems reasonable. Keep inside that line and build a city. So has the Matthew Plan any kind of positive aspects about stopping suburban growth, or did it just cause people to manipulate suburban growth where they wanted it? I suspect most people weren't really worried about the Matthew Plan other than the BDP, Belfast Urban Area Plan, and that put down parameters about how you develop in a city and would propose the road infrastructures and slum dwelling replacement. I suspect most architects then do what a lot of people do now. You were told to do it, so you did it. That notion about someone with authority saying this is the right thing to do for your city, and if you want to be the right person for your city, you'll do this. And a lot of people fell into that pattern.
But the biggest change in Belfast over the years has been the depopulation. Basically over the past 40, 50 years, Belfast population has gone down from just under 500,000 people to currently about 273,000. And at the same time, all the medium-sized towns surrounding Belfast all increased by the same amount. And that links together with the post-Second World War industrial decline. And the authorities at the time were kind of saying, right, how do we arrest this? How cheap Belfast was then to plan these industrial areas, and there was in Antrim, in Craigavon, right, to then to service these new areas by a new road network, and then to move the population to these new industrial areas. But at that time, the BBC were questioning why were they knocking down all these buildings to make way for a road where there was such a housing crisis in the city.
A lot of the decisions that were made in the late 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, and we are still attempting to restitch the gaps that have been left by those decisions. Craigavon came about because they wanted to put Lurgan and join it with Portadown. This whole thing has to be looked upon with the political setup. There was a rumour that the border would be recast around the middle of Lochmary and up to Coleraine. And you would get the new university in Coleraine, Belfast of course, and then Craigavon. And that would be the new Northern Ireland.
The minute the Matthew report was published in 1963, John Oliver started the recruitment process for the new city design team, and they put out one big vesting order.
6,000 acres.
6,000 acres.
I mean, that's mind-blowing.
Geoffrey Copcott was the chief architect. At the end of the day, there was a big row because he suddenly realised that he was getting involved with a political mess.
I remember meeting him for the first time. He sat at the top of a long desk with a huge check suit and the Santa Claus beard or whatever. He was just a crazy guy. But of course we all thought he was wonderful because he was so inspirational with his thinking, you know.
He said that the Matthew plan was seriously flawed because it didn't take enough account of Derry, and he did a big article for the Belfast newsletter, and he was getting heavily involved in a major political issue, and Dr. Oliver had him up and he wouldn't apologise. He either resigned or he was asked to go.
You're dealing with a time in the 60s, that's the Matthew plan, when things were influenced by Corbusier and so on, and it was all to do with the belief that everybody, all friends, neighbours were working together. Wow, isn't this wonderful, streets in the sky? Of course that wasn't the case. And we ended up, fortunately, only having Divis, but it didn't last long, it was knocked down.
Divis again was a political sort of, it was awful. I mean, you've got to put it in context of when they were done. It was meant to be a wonderful scheme that had stitched in so many people into this multi-storey building. It really is absolutely crazy, but it was being done because of the demand for housing. Slum clearance had to be done. Voting fodder had to be provided, and that's what all these estates were for. There are political aspects that really maybe can overwhelm the architectural scene. It's there, and you can't avoid it.
These things are accidents of history rather than somehow predetermined by some master plan. Planning is never about a blueprint like an architect's drawing and that this is the way it's to be built and let's persist. I think Matthew was a child of his time, if you like. That was what was happening in the 60s. There was a head of steam, and that head of steam wasn't there a decade later. Well, believe it or not, this is Belfast of the future, Belfast after the revolution.
What do you expect to see on the ground level here under the motorway? There are plans being developed at the present time to do landscaping work in the area, community areas and so forth, and I think at the end of the day one will find it a very exciting area as a northern entry to the city proper.
was a bustling area. You had 5,000 people lived in this area at that time, Protestant and Catholic, cheek by jowl. And given the fact that it was Belfast, Roman Catholic people would have called it Sailorstown, whereas Protestant people called it York Street.
Sailorstown was a tight-knit community. My mother's sisters and brothers all sort of settled in the immediate area of Marine Street, which was where my grandparents lived. I had maybe a dozen cousins who lived within shouting distance of me. Sailorstown's boundaries were Corporation Street, Garmoil Street at the seaward side, and York Street at the city side, and Whittle Street was identified as the starting point. Where the end point is still a mystery, and as a poem of Tommy O'Hara's started from Whittle Street to God knows where. And there's many a broken nose and broken jaw where people thought that they were being left out of the area.
There was that sense of identity as well, that sense of difference. I think that's been evidenced by the number of people in the last 15 years who say that they come from Sailorstown, and they would like to have come from Sailorstown. There was a different identity. It was an exotic sort of place to a certain extent, certainly compared to the rest of Belfast. Quite a number of the men went to sea, were merchant mariners. It had the experience of a number of residents who had actually been around the world. It was much more outward looking. The rest of Belfast was a lot more parochial and buttoned up than the likes of Sailorstown would have been. My own family, 4 generations, were seafarers, and their attitudes were different.
Every street along here would have had 1 or 2 pubs at each corner. So there was a drinking culture in the place, but the seamen added to that, particularly when American naval boats would arrive. We as kids had a field day because you just ran out, Mister, give me a penny. And then if he didn't give you a penny, he says, "Come on, give me a bit of chewing gum." And then the question was, well, have you any big sisters? You know, and could you take me home and introduce me? And so, you know, at that you were crafty enough to say, no, haven't.
The motorway cut a swathe right through the docks. I mean, there were literally thousands of people lived in York Street in those days. So the people at the City Hall must have realised that somewhere like Shore Crescent or Twinbrook were never going to be able to cater for the number of people who needed rehousing. Promises were made that houses would be built near to the motorway, but people only realised that this wasn't going to happen as time had worn on, and they formed a residents' committee very late in the day and attempted to negotiate. But as you can imagine, a huge body like the Belfast Corporation swatted aside any sort of complaints, and the demolition just went ahead.
According to what my mother said, they were promised to be housed back in their own area. And she was moved out probably early '69 and moved down to Shore Crescent. Now, she still maintained that they had been promised a return to housing in Sailorstown, and it was only when she got to Shore Crescent and probably into her 2nd year there that she realised she was never coming back. She always sort of yearned to be back down here, would walk from there to St. Joseph's on a Sunday morning for Mass until she was no longer able to walk.
The clergy stood in the pulpit in St. Joseph's and told people that they would be rehoused. The fact that the Catholic Church was one of the major landowners in this area may have something to do with that.
It was like a life raft for people. As the parish dwindled and people moved away, they were left with sort of a derelict church. People still walked from the flats that they'd been moved to go to couple of masses that they provided, and then the priest, one without any sort of consultation with those who were attending, just got up on the altar and said, next Sunday the bishop will be here to close the church.
There was a love for the place and a very protective feeling towards it. So we all assumed there would never be houses again, but that the church could remain as a focal point. And when the Roman Catholic Church, for them to say that next week is the finish, was the last straw, I think, for many people. People who had basically accepted the demolition of their homes and the diaspora around the city. We weren't against development, and we weren't against change. There are some people here who are trying to regenerate this area and have more houses built, but it can't be the same as it was, because the same people aren't there. The memory is still there and the history is still being recounted. I think that's all you can ask for. I mean, no matter what passage of time you're talking about, things move on.
In a neat little town they call Belfast, apprentice to trade I was bound. Many an hour sweet happiness that I spent in that neat little town. A sad misfortune came over me. Which caused me to stray from the land. Far away from my friends and relations, betrayed by the black velvet band. Her eyes, they shone like diamonds, I thought her the queen of the land. And her hair hung over her shoulder, tied up with a black velvet band.
People thought it was the bombs were damaging Belfast. You saw photographs of dereliction and captured underneath Belfast under trouble. You actually, if you knew the buildings or where it was, you'd say, oh, the housing executive just cleared that area. That's why it's not there. Yeah. And there was so much, road service pushing things through, housing executive demolishing most of the housing in inner Belfast, and developers on top of that. So the Troubles certainly contributed to it, and they contributed to that feeling of powerlessness. Yeah. But it was actually very much driven by other people as well.
Charles came back to Northern Ireland, having been at Oxford, having spent a bit of time in France, and he got involved with the National Trust and said, "But give me the books to read," typical scholar. And the chairman of the National Trust said, "Oh, books, and there are no books on architecture." So then Charlie, of course, being Charlie, thought, well, there must be a need to write one. And it's so beautifully written. I still find walking around now, you look at the decoration on the buildings.
During that time, the discussion of history of architecture stopped at London. I think there was mention of Dublin, and Belfast didn't come into it. So when Charlie's book, Buildings of Belfast, appeared in 1967, he suddenly said there are buildings in Belfast worth looking at. And there were lots of things, not just the demolition by developers, but bombs as well. There were buildings going all the time, and there was no chance of doing much conservation in Belfast.
It was sort of political turmoil. There was no listed building protection in Northern Ireland. It was just at the time Charlie was looking at things and thinking there is important stuff here that needs to be saved, and it's really going very quickly. There was the Deaf and Dumb Institute, there was Queen's Elms, there was the Gate Lodge at Botanic Garden. They were all being demolished, all important buildings.
Two of the early listings, in the first 10 listings, there was the Palm House in the Botanic Gardens, which was under threat at that time, and the Opera House. You know, if you mentioned to anyone, what are your buildings you know in Belfast, your favourite buildings, probably the Palm House and the Opera House would be two of the ones that would come forward in people's mind.
His influence on housing was profound in a number of ways. First of all, he chaired a working group in 1973, which set out a set of principles for housing design, what layout should look like, what the building form should be. He said from now on the preference would be no greenfield development, move away from multi-storey flats, Parker Morris standards. He also had things to say about what brickwork should be used. So that was on the physical side, but the other thing I think he probably made a huge impact here was just the whole approach to fairness, particularly to the selection scheme. He really got nowhere with conservation in the social housing scene because it was too costly, it was too impractical, it took too long and stuff like that.
But he probably would have spent any money on building quality, or inherent character to preserve it. But even though he came from the same class that ran the Unionist Party in Northern Ireland, and in a sense ran the government, he was prepared to be different. He never sought any awards or power or position by going with the establishment. So he was an anti-establishment figure, yet he conveyed the impression of being of the same class in a sense. He didn't want to join the administration. He was also against religious bigotry in all its forms. His place in the Labour Party is quite important because he was a Labourer, and I think he had some of the prejudices of those of us who were in the Labour Party. There was a gentleman's agreement between nationalists and unionists over where houses would be built, and the Labour Party was opposed to that, and they were opposed to political influence on housing, and I think Charlie went for that model.
Charlie's criticism would have been whatever building local authorities done, the standard to which they were built was very poor. Secondly, they weren't always let on a proper allocation policy, and he did point out to the housing trust model as being the model which you should base a single comprehensive housing authority around.
Remember, we're talking about social housing where some people would argue that it should be of a low standard, whereas Parker Morris standards were adopted. There was no emphasis on economy in construction in order to get more low standard housing. The idea was to defend the standard, and it resulted in possibly some delay in the Housing Executive's programme. The debates that took place inside the executive in the beginning was whether they should go ahead with the houses that were already designed and ready to go, or whether they should be redesigned to Parker Morris standards. I'm not entirely sure if I agree with the characterisation of Belfast City Council housing as bad housing. He had very high standards.
He did an enormous lot of work to give people decent houses, but it stopped there. What happened was the housing executive made you build their standard plans, irrespective of context, and it ruined the old Victorian street patterns, because it had all sorts of things like shared service and gardens and car parking come into play. So yes, he did a lot of good, but like all of these people do a lot of good, they don't stand back and look at the bigger picture.
He wouldn't balance modern stuff.
No, he just didn't want to know modern. He didn't want to understand it. He didn't want to sympathise with it.
And if you think that heritage is tomorrow's heritage, which is what modern building is about, then you have to sort of say that he didn't like heritage.
He wouldn't allow himself to like it. He wouldn't, and even if he did, he wouldn't admit it.
But you take it as a negative, he might have had a big influence in Belfast, you know. His heritage was blinkered.
Yes, very blinkered.
Old building.
I don't know if he was blinkered. I think Charlie would have very much held up his hands and said he wasn't an expert in modern architecture. And I think with the modern stuff, he more or less kind of said he didn't know enough about it to judge it. I mean, he didn't comment an awful lot. He did just sort of draw a line, and he wasn't really that interested. He was more interested in the individual buildings or the context.
His concern was preserving things which he thought were important. I mean, I think he thought Georgian buildings.
Nice aesthetic.
And he had his tastes in Victorian architecture. When it comes to modern architecture, the aesthetic is entirely different. So his interest was preserving things he thought were important, rather than to worry about the niceties of whether you put 7 stories or 8 stories on a building.
He once said, you know, I sometimes wonder if I would have been better focusing on one thing. And I think he had less of an awareness of all that he'd achieved than maybe we do, especially with hindsight. And I think he wasn't as confident as he would have appeared. You know, he appeared a very confident person, but very likeable. But I could see why some people would find him very difficult. He was very acerbic. I mean, he didn't suffer fools gladly, and he could be very sharp, and he couldn't bear sort of hypocrisy. So there are a few government officials I've talked to, I think, who have not particularly happy memories.
But he could take it as well as give it. You know, so if you were working with Charlie and he was sharp or too witty at your expense, and you replied in the same, he would have regarded that as touche. He wouldn't have been offended by a reply in kind.
I think the reputation for short-temperedness comes from his feeling of lack of time. The fact that he had to get through so much. So, for instance, people would say he would have his lunch every day in the Reform Club, and he would sit in the corner window and read his paper. And people would say, you know, he never talks to anyone. But actually, he had to get through the paper in 5 minutes because he had to meet someone else in lunchtime and then get back to work and run some massive legal contract and then do something as a housing executive. And his day was packed. So
about
he find time for small talk. And
yes, he wasn't a small talker. Definitely not. He wrote beautifully. He painted very skillfully. I mean, you'd say he was an artist, but, you know, and all these things. And he was like a sort of multi-talented sort of Victorian.
His influence is still felt. You know, every week we saw something comes up and say, Charlie would have done it that way. He's still very much an influence on what anyone in conservation here does.